and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a beer from Martin House Brewing Company. I've done several of their beers over the years, though it has been quite a long time. This, as all of them I've gotten, I did get from Tavour, and this came in a nice box. It was a 2 12-ounce can set. They always have really cool label art. The beer in question today is their 2022 release of Kokytus. It's an Imperial Stout that was rye whiskey barrel aged and has added cacao nibs. This one clocks in at 14% ABV. Martin House is based in Fort Worth, Texas. So, label art on here. First, I'll show you the name itself, Kokytus. You'll notice it looks kind of like a funky, ancient-looking script, maybe a bit Greek. Well, Kokytus is indeed, in Greek mythology, the name of the river in Hades. So I am guessing then that the label art here, which looks quite cool, is perhaps the ferry boatman in Hades himself. So that's what I'm guessing, and I don't know the significance of why they would call it that, but at least it's themed correctly. So, Kokytus, 14%, the 2022 release. We're just going to get this cracked. I'm using my nice all-purpose Sam Adams glass today. This is just a 12-ouncer, so this should fit in this glass or come very, very close to it. Let's get this poured. Quite dark, quite thick. Slow it down, slow it down, slow it down. All right. Yeah, that formed a nice head. You don't always get that poured in a glass. All right, beautiful. Spin that around. Visually, absolutely pitch black as expected. Formed a nice creamy head. Let's give it a sniff. Oh yeah, oh yeah. You can smell the barrels on there, and you can smell some of the cacao, and you smell a little bit of roastiness. But in general, the aroma is not as pungent as I expected. Just knowing that it's barrel aged, though they do specify on the can it was only barrel aged for 4 months. So maybe a bit less amount of time than you would normally find, which obviously is going to have an impact on both the flavor character traits as well as the aroma. So, you know, a year, 2 year barrel aged beer is going to smell very bold, very pungent, typically going to lean very heavily into the barrels. So I'm expecting this might be one of those more delicate, more nuanced beers. Has the added benefit of the barrel aging for the aroma and the flavor profile, but still staying true and letting the actual beer underneath itself speak. We will soon find out. Head had settled down. I still got about a quarter to half an inch left floating on top, so it's a very nice formed head here at home. Let's give it one more sniff for good measure. Yep, no new information. Smells exactly like it did on first sip. Just you have to work for it a little bit, get right up on it. So take one. Here it goes. Ooh. Yeah, boy. That is a big, intense beer. Wow. Yes. Oh, I am all about that. Okay. So my suspicions were correct. The shorter amount of time in the barrels is playing a major point into the balance of this beer. And I got to say, for my money, I really, really like what they're doing with this. So before we get into the flavor profile, let's talk weight and let's talk texture. This is 14% ABV. This beer really feels kind of a strong medium, lower end of medium heavy, so it's not quite as heavy or weighty as you would expect for a 14% ABV Imperial Stout. So didn't meet my expectation there. Indeed, for the ABV range for the style, it's below average. But it's not that big of a detractor. It's just a little atypical. In terms of the mouthfeel, this one, kind of similarly to the body, it doesn't have quite that resistance I expected. This doesn't get creamy, it doesn't get silky, it doesn't get velvety. It gets a little bit foamy, and you can feel a little bit of the resistance, but it doesn't feel anywhere as thick as I expected, especially considering how thick it looked as I poured it. So the body and mouthfeel are definitely atypical for the beer style and the ABV range, but I'm not going to dwell on that too much because there's a lot to talk about in the flavor profile. So the first thing that hits you immediately as you swallow, you do get immediate rye whiskey barrel, and it tastes of whiskey, and it has that kind of sharp, spicy twinge that rye whiskey tends to have. And immediately behind that, you're hit with just this big burst of roast. It's extremely roasty, very, very dark roast, very earthy, a lot of char. There's a lot of kind of very overtly caramelized malts in this. Indeed, there's elements of it that do put me in mind of coffee, though it doesn't taste of coffee. Just very, very darkly, deeply roasted malts. And there's not really even a suggestion of smokiness in this, maybe the most subtle of hints, but just think of like the richest, darkest roasted malt you could possibly get that leans heavily into that kind of earthy, roasty side without there being an overt smokiness to it and without there being overt caramel nuances. It's leaning heavily into the roasty side of this malt bill. And indeed, it does dominate in the flavor profile. So the barrels are quite clear on the nose and in the flavor profile, but what I expected, since it was only aged for 4 months, is that the underlying malt bill itself is the star of the show. There is cacao nibs added to this. You can taste it. In this one, there's no hint of sweetness at all. It does taste of dark chocolate. So think dark, rich cacao nibs, like proper cacao. It's not milk chocolate with sugar added. So yeah, it's very, very nice. It's a big, bold, dark, intense beer that leans very heavily onto the roasted malt side of the equation, which is kind of what I expected might be in this glass, and I'm happy about it. And indeed, my suspicion was correct. So for my money, it's a very, very good beer. You don't get a ton of beers like this. Typically, they'll leave them in the barrel a bit longer. They'll move in different directions. So to get one that's this big, bold, intense, and roasty, really leaning in that side of the malt bill centric nature of the stout, it's a breath of fresh air. It's, you know, 1 out of maybe every 5 to 10, if you're lucky, is going to be like that these days, it seems. But Martin House did it right, for my money. So I'm going to jump back in for a second sip. We're going to let everything re-intensify. Make sure I didn't miss any nuance here. Then we're going to talk about the balance in the finish. Take 2. Yet again, immediately struck by the lack of weight and thickness of the beer, but you're immediately hit with this just big intensity. Rye barrel, backs off, immediate quick blossoming of the underlying malt bill. It's very intense, it's very roasty. On second sip, I am actually starting to pick out some coffee undertones. A lot of char, and still, again, it's not smoky, but there are subtle suggestions of it. It's leaning very, very heavily into deep, dark roast territory. There's no caramel notes, no toffee notes. There's no, caramelization. There's a lot of richness and earthiness underneath it. There's a decent bit of bitters for what the beer and the beer style is. More than you would typically find, and that's really coming from strictly this malt bill. It's that deeply roasted edge of the malt bill. That's where it's coming from. And the cacao, yeah, definitely the cacao nibs. They are tasting very much a very dark cacao, dark chocolate. Think dark chocolate. No sweetness in sight at all. It's not sweet. Indeed, it's earthy, it's roasty, and, with a decent twinge of bitters. That rye whiskey barrel, after that initial push, it really backs down. It leads with the malt bill. And then once they both finally finish their intensity and drop down to kind of where they're just on their even playing field before they work their way to the finish, I would say it leans about 2/3 malt bill, 1/3 whiskey barrel. That's about the presence that I'm getting on the flavor profile. This beer does have a long finish. It's longer than I expected, considering that it was only aged for 4 months in the barrel. And it's really a combination of both the barrel as well as the intensity of the earthy, roasty, kind of bitter edge of the malt bill underneath. So it definitely drives out longer than average. It's not quite top tier, but it's well above average to be certain. And yeah, it's really, really nice. It kind of holds that same even 2/3, 1/3 ratio of malt bill to barrel all the way to the end. I would say that this is in excess of a good minute and a half after each sip, but it doesn't quite make it to 2 minutes. It does leave the palate a little bit before that. So definitely above average, but not quite top tier. So yeah, this is a very good beer, guys. It's kind of exactly what I was hoping it would be. I've enjoyed all of the Martin House beers I've had. I've gotten mine all from Tavour. Same with this one. When I see a Martin House beer pop up, I grab it because I've been very impressed with this brewer, and this is another in that line that is just really, really impressing me. They know what they're doing there in Fort Worth. Guys, this is a great beer. I'm going to take my time, step on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get this one ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. This was Martin House Brewing Company's Kokytus, the 2022 release. This is an Imperial Stout that was rye whiskey barrel aged. This one clocked in at 14% ABV. Martin House is based in Fort Worth, Texas. So yeah, guys, another really tasty beer by Martin House here. This one did pretty well in most categories, but there were a few notable exceptions where this beer did not get a perfect score. So we're just going to go down the line top to bottom. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was fine. It was nice. It smelled much like I would expect a rye whiskey barrel aged Imperial Stout to smell, though it wasn't quite as pungent on the nose with the barrel, which I did kind of anticipate actually, given that they only aged it for 4 months, I believe it says on the can. Let me just double check. That's correct, just for 4 months. So it definitely did have a noticeable impact on the pungency of the aroma. The cacao came through okay, but yeah, in general, it just wasn't super pungent. Now this did form a pretty nice, thick, creamy head, but it really had a hard time penetrating out of that to really let the aroma out. It was really just high end of average for my expectation, and the aroma does get a 6 out of 10. For the taste, I thought it was absolutely delicious. It was exactly what I was hoping for. And yeah, the barrel aging side was a bit more subtle because it didn't spend as much time in the barrel, but it really let the underlying malt bill shine through, and I thought it was absolutely delicious. The taste gets a 10 out of 10. For the body, this is one of the categories that kind of surprised me. This is a 14% ABV on an Imperial Stout, and this really didn't feel super hefty. I mean, it was kind of the low end of average here. I would have expected a nice, full, medium heavy, maybe even bordering on heavy in this ABV range, and it didn't deliver that. So the body, I did give a 4 out of 10. The mouthfeel was very much a similar story to the body here. It just didn't have that viscosity and that resistance that you would expect to feel on an ABV range this high on this beer style. So it also was low end of average. The mouthfeel, I also gave a 4 out of 10. For the finish on this was actually quite a bit longer than anticipated, given the relative lack of pungency of the barrels on this one, but I did kind of expect it. And that being said, compared to other barrel-aged counterparts, sure, it wasn't as long, but for how they aged it, it was very, very good. The finish, I gave a 9 out of 10. Head and retention, this one did a fantastic job to be poured at home. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the appearance, absolutely pitch black as expected. That also gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on here is what I really think made this beer. And for me, for what this beer is, it comes down to the time in the barrels. It made for a much more subtle, more layered beer, both in aroma and flavor profile. All of the elements were there. It just wasn't quite as in-your-face leading with that barrel. So it really let the underlying malt bill speak, which is a good thing in this beer because it was absolutely delicious. The balance, I gave a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling/intangible, subjectively, I loved it. I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. And finally, example of the style. So in general, this was a very good example of a barrel-aged Imperial Stout, but it did lose some pretty big points, notably in body and mouthfeel, and it lost a few in aroma as well. So it's not quite a perfect example, but points that it lost aside, those really didn't impact what the beer was all about, in my opinion. I only docked a single point here, so example of the style gets a 9 out of 10, which does leave Martin House Brewing Company's 2022 release of Kokytus with an 82 out of 100. Guys, well above average beer here. The aroma, the body, the mouthfeel aside, if you can put those aside and you're just after a very, very tasty beer, a big, high ABV, barrel-aged Imperial Stout, this is a winner. All of the beers I've had from Martin House have been great. This is another in building up a pretty long lineup here that I would absolutely recommend you keep your eyes out for. Folks, that is today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just turn on your notifications by hitting that bell icon. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.